It's great to be here today and be back again, I guess, from there. And the topic that I'm going to talk about today is cloud security posture management, why it matters and how it works. Let me just do a little bit of an intro first as to who I am and how I'm here. So my name is Jennifer Cox. I have been working in the cybersecurity industry now for 10 years, working in tech then for around 20 years. And currently I'm working as a solutions engineering director in Times. We do workflow automation for security. I also run the Irish side of WiCyS, Women in Cybersecurity, across UK, and I am on the board for the UK and I part of it, but I run the whole Irish country side of it as such from there. I've been heavily involved in everything to do with mentoring, coaching, getting people involved in cyber, in tech, and then supporting people that are different as well, including neurodivergence, as a very proud neurodivergent myself. So one of the things that I love to do most, which is what I'll be doing today, is to talk about cybersecurity in a way that makes sense to everybody, so that you don't have to be either a practitioner, a degree holder, or a scientist in order to follow what's being discussed, because the security aspect is important for everybody to understand and for everyone to have some sort of an involvement or responsibility towards. So my goal is always to make it as straightforward and as simple as possible for anyone that has it or needs to have it or is involved in it to understand. So that's the goal for today. And with that, I'm going to get stuck into it. So CSPM is cloud security posture management, which is really a really nice way of saying managing all of your security in the cloud. So traditionally, at least when I got involved in tech first, security was both physical and then within a local environment, more often than not, eventually then becoming a little bit more widespread with the internet. And then after the internet, I guess the worldwide network beyond that, having your own internal networks that were locked down and the security for those versus the public web then from there. But with cloud security, I guess the biggest differentiator being that your information is not hosted on a physical machine, typically in your location. Typically, there are exceptions to every rule, of course, and most often we see those exceptions in places like public sector, education, health industry, stuff like that, where they might have their own environments depending on the size of the company or the industry that they're in. And one of the things that spoke about the most when it comes to the cloud security posture problem is misconfiguration. And misconfiguration often comes from a lack of understanding of exactly the impact of that configuration or what's being configured in many cases. So whilst there are a lot of cloud professionals and those that are managing cloud environments, at least statistically, people that are managing those environments still don't have the level of knowledge that is needed to manage it in such a granular way that they could be 100% sure that all of the access that they've given, the permissions, the location, the security measures that they have in place are enough, as tight as possible, adjust and move as dynamically as is needed to within that environment as often as possible. And that's where the misconfiguration tends to happen. So in most cases, what happens is more access is given than is needed. So you're not aligning to the only giving people access to what they absolutely need. And people have too much access, and that's where the issues can happen. So in what we've seen is in 80%, more than 80% of cloud security breaches, it's been down to misconfiguration. And I'm sure if you tap around and have a look at any security issues, when it comes to physical ones, whether it's break-ins in cars or buildings, it's often tied back to somebody left a window unlocked, left a door ajar, left something uncovered. And when it comes to traditional access on traditional networks, it will be somebody maybe physically gaining access to that network or getting somebody's password. And the situation isn't that much different when you apply it to the cloud, other than, again, you don't always have ownership of the physical environment that stuff is in. And in many cases, people don't understand the language in relation to the technical environment. So it can become a bit of a challenge from that perspective from there. So what is CSPM? This is the actual definition of it. So automated tools to discover, monitor, and remediate security issues across cloud environments. So anyone that is involved in security at all, in cybersecurity at all, knows that those keywords are discover, monitor, and remediate are the main things you'll find yourself involved in. You'll have different teams at different working in different sides of that per se. I spend a lot of my career on the preventative side and the discovery side and the monitoring side. And the earlier stages were actually on the remediation, the later stages on the discovery and monitoring. But when you combine all of those things together, that's the sweet spot. So when you look at a cloud environment, the goal would be to know everything that's in your cloud environment, which would be your discovery part of it, and then keep an eye on everything that's there with your monitoring part of it and seeing what's changing within that environment, and then as to identify issues, then remediate those issues, ideally as fast as possible. And believe it or not, again, if I roll back to those three sort of ages, you talk about physical security. It's when you're like doing a survey of the location, making sure your doors are locked before you leave the house, and then keeping an eye on it, as we might do with our remote videos and cameras and such that we might have at home. And then if we discover that there is a problem and a door unlocked, we get it fixed. And same with physical security or physical traditional network security. Same kind of idea. You'll be finding faulty cables, doors that don't lock, places or environments that aren't password protected, that access or people have access to that they shouldn't. Within cloud environments, once you have the ability to do all of these things at a much greater scale in a more cost-effective way, to still be able to get all the same information, that with that comes additional challenges, because you are able to find more things and do it faster, which then means there's much more information being plowed towards the individual or teams that are managing that environment. And in many cases, in any part of cybersecurity, a lot of the issues relate to the number of resources that you have in place to resolve the issues that you find, or to identify even the issues that you find. I certainly know that in my career, I've spoken to many an end user in cloud security or team that have been surprised to find that they actually have more assets than they thought on their network. When you combine your physical assets and then like anything that's on a traditional network, and then your cloud assets as well. And most commonly, the biggest surprises are what's in the cloud environment. So let's take, for example, you have a company that has any kind of development. You have a software development team or anyone maintaining software, and they have permission to spin up assets as and when they need, so that they can test things within their environment. Most people will have like a test environment and a production environment. In those kind of situations, we'll often discover that there's more assets up live and running than previously anticipated or expected by the security teams. And that, again, rolling back to the very first slide, is usually down to the permissions. So you'll typically give your dev teams more permissions because you want them to spin up things and test them and make sure they're good before they go out, before they go into production. But how you manage that can become an issue. You could have devs running up assets and not shutting them down, running up assets that have bugs or issues in the OS or in the core environments of them, and not remediating those and not shutting it down. So it can snowball really, really quickly once you have any number of people that are able to create and have permissions to add assets and devices to your network. If you're not getting ahead of that by actively discovering the devices when they are spun up on your network, and keeping an eye on the security levels of those devices and permissions of access as you go. So how it works, these are the four things that we were talking about. Actually, I didn't mention risk prioritization in the beginning, and that's we have an ideal, and then we have what's realistic in the world as such. So with the discovery side of it, often people will use any number of tools to identify if an asset is connected to a network. So for example, like today, I was expecting to come to you from Wexford in Ireland, but I'm actually coming to you from Glasgow as I'm moving my son into university. And in any university, for example, you'll find they'll have like a public network where students can connect their devices to that network. If you were to discover assets on a network like that, you'd have a massive volume of assets popping up continuously. Everything from mobile devices to tablets to laptops to game systems, whatever is being connected to that network. And you would have some sort of responsibility on if you're managing that network with regards to safety and security of it, and most importantly to ensure that that network, the public one, isn't anyway connected to any internal networks that you have, say, within the university there. So there'll be two different kinds of discovery. You might discover the assets on a public network like that and just know what kind of assets are being connected so that you can monitor, is the network being used for its intended purpose, or is somebody like streaming or using high volumes of, or sending high volumes of traffic either up or down the network and causing problems on the public side. Whereas the internal network, because it's internal and people may have to validate their access, use usernames, passwords to connect to that network, you'll naturally get more information about the devices that are connected to the network, and then potentially more information about the intention of those devices and the security state of those devices. So let's say on an internal network, you only allow students to connect laptops to the internal network, but when they do, then you can see what OS they're using, their laptop name, IP addresses, how long they're on the network, and then if you can collect information like the patch levels of those devices, then too, you could potentially mandate that devices have to be at X, whatever OS version or patched version, in order to be connected to the network if you wanted to. I know lots of universities do it in lots of different ways, and in the same way in the workplace. I'm sure everybody at some place in a workplace has had a notification pop up on their device saying that you need to have X patch installed by within 24 hours. And that's the same kind of idea. It's been identified by your security team through discovery, so they know about your asset, they know about the information your asset's reporting back. When it comes to cloud devices, it works in the very same way, but it's way faster to spin up those assets. So people can spin up one or two if they're testing, but it's also the potential to spin up hundreds and thousands of assets at any given time. So say, think of a company like Netflix. Every time somebody watches a show on Netflix, it spins up an asset. And every time you stop watching that show, the asset shuts down and it's gone for good. It doesn't come back again. And so that's where you get that little notification that says, like, are you still there? Because it costs money to run up those assets. So if you're not actually watching it, they'll shut down the asset, and whilst they'll bookmark where you were at, they'll spin up another asset again then later. So they're not paying while the asset's up and running, you're just using it while you need to. So you imagine at times whatever number of million people might be watching Netflix at any one time. That's a lot of assets that are being spun up and shut down and spun up and shut down. So having continuous discovery and assessment at that time means that you can verify that the assets are at the minimum level that you need them to be at for security. And then when it comes to risk prioritization, the same thing applies as would have for traditional networks. If you, like I was saying, maybe you mandate that everybody's laptop needs to be at whatever level in order for them to be permitted to connect to the network, or if they're not at that level, they may call IT and get updated call ID and then get their permission to connect to the network again. That's a bit more traditional. On the cloud side of things, what you can do is, because you've got all of this information that's accessible to you immediately, and if you use automation or other tools as well alongside it, you could potentially do things like set your bar for your risk. So you'll identify vulnerabilities that are on those assets. You'll identify the kind of assets that they are. You'll be able to group them into short-lived assets, long-lived assets, public-facing, not public-facing, and then identify where your highest risks are across the assets that you own. Again, if it's a small environment, like at home, no real issues, it's easier to identify. If it's in a bigger environment, like a business or a school or a uni, that's definitely something you're going to want to have decided in advance. And then if it's an even bigger environment, like Netflix, where things are being spun up and down all the time, you're going to want to be really clear about your expectations and prioritization of risk with those assets. So you would expect that no asset for anyone watching any shows anywhere would be below whatever your minimum secure expectation of an asset is. And if you saw, you'd have notifications for anything that you saw being spun up within your environment that doesn't meet those expectations and rules in place with regards who can or can't have access to it, whether they can stay up, what the purpose is, who gets the alerts, all of that kind of stuff. So when you're looking at CSPM, automation is so important to be able to identify where your risks are at and get to them quickly. It may have been easier to identify that in the past or not. We could debate that one all day, depending on how you manage your network. But doing it in a cloud environment is so important because of the speed that these assets can be created, do some damage, and then shut down again. You want to be catching them as soon as it happens. And then remediation. Obviously, if you've set a rule and said anybody that is on Windows version less than 11 point whatever, I want to be notified of it, or they can't connect to the network. Can't connect to the network is grand, you've shut down your problem straight away. But let's say you have to let them connect to the network, you're not allowed to have anybody not connected to it. Then you need to see what kind of rule you have in place, like that force alert that you get from your IT team that says that you must update. At least you're sending a remediation notification to the end user and making them update it if there's a person at the end of it. But if you're using assets on scale again, then what you do is you start looking at building it into your CI/CD pipeline, which we'll talk about later, where there's minimum requirements for those assets that have to be a part of the build before it's pushed into production. So we'll get to that shortly, but remediation certainly needs to be included, and automation and remediation is really important. But I know for me, maybe it's just because remediation for me was something that I physically had to go into an office and do many years ago. So it's always really important you include the human in that part of it if you are automating, to make sure that you don't accidentally automate an update on an asset that's going to cause you production issues. So let's go to the next one. There we go. So yes, on the technical features and capabilities, when you're looking at the CSPM side of things, obviously because you have access to like massive resources for assets or little assets, or everything is just there for you to pick and choose and set up immediately without having to go purchase any parts like the old days. It's a lot easier for you to set up much more complex environments and much more difficult to manage assets, I guess, and as well. And then if you have integration, or if you have a DevSecOps, if you have a development team, a CI/CD pipeline, what you would, in an ideal world, what you would do is integrate your CSPM solution with that. If you don't, like I say, what tends to happen is you can have the best, most creative development team in the world, creating awesome product, getting it pushed out into production, and generally not as much consideration for security as you would typically have when your security teams are involved in that. Dev create, they do wonderful work and they're so innovative and less concerned about security and more concerned about actually creating good product typically at the end of the day. When you combine that with the security team, they're not always dev's best friends because they usually slow down a lot of what they want to do. So if you have the opportunity to integrate a CSPM product into your DevSecOps, it means that you can mandate certain minimum requirements within those assets as dev are using them. So whilst they're making the changes to product, you can mandate checks as you go through before something is pushed into production. You can mandate minimum builds in place. So when they've got their libraries and their builds, you can remove unsupported ones, or just simply mandate that they have supported ones in place, that they must be at XYZ level in order to release something in production. And you can also build into it automated, would be scanning or like risk discovery there too. So if they were able to build an asset that in the space of time between them creating that asset in the morning and maybe a bug notification going out in the afternoon, and they want to push it at the end of the day, that they could, if you automate it all, they could be notified that there's a bug in their build that needs to be fixed before they push it to production by the end of the day. Now that's quick versus like say if you think about your own physical asset, and maybe like Microsoft do monthly pushes of their patches for remediation. So you could potentially be several weeks with a bug before you get an opportunity to patch it from there or identify it. When you're talking about a cloud environment, and certainly with DevSecOps, the potential to identify and flag a bug can be like immediate, or almost immediate is what we like to refer, rather near real time, as they say on the screen there, just in case it's not actually in real time, but it's usually within minutes, which is the best solution to have if you have a lot of activity and a lot of push into a production environment. And then of course you're going to get all of the latest and greatest when you look at CSPM solutions, and there's always more innovation and more activity because more and more people are moving to cloud products, even on a personal level besides business too, because it's manageable, it's easy to use with regards to spinning up assets, and you get a lot more bang for your buck with the choices that you make when you're creating a build. You imagine you have a project that you're running and you have to create a pretty heavy duty infrastructure in order to run a project, but you know you won't need that infrastructure after 6 weeks. That'd be a very expensive purchase to make if you have to physically buy all of that hardware, but it's only a short-term expense on the cloud side while you spin it up and then shut it down when the project is over. So there's a lot of reasons to do that, to move that. And apart from also the security, if you've got end users and they're using SaaS products, it means everything that they're accessing is already in the cloud. They're accessing it through a browser, and there's really no reason for anybody to have any data saved locally, which means it's going to reduce the risk of any data being saved locally and then being exposed if that person's laptop gets lost or stolen. So from that, I was looking for some analogies, which I think I've already thrown about a dozen at you accidentally, but I think the one that people tend to talk about the most is actually house security and car security as well. Like when you look at cloud security, it's the same thing as car security. Would you leave your window ajar when you get out of your brand spanking new, I don't know, Tesla, Porsche, whatever it is that you want, and then walk away from it? Would you leave the window cracked? No, because it seems like a really obvious security flaw to do that when the car is so fancy and so important and so expensive. It just doesn't make sense to do it. And when it comes to cloud security, in the same vein, setting up a complex and technical environment, even if it's not complex, it's costing you money the whole time that it's up and running, and then not putting the right security measures in place, something like an unencrypted cloud bucket, and you're just leaving it there for anyone to kind of tap into if they want. It's no different than leaving that window cracked in the car as well. You're just leaving your really expensive, brand new, fancy asset completely exposed by not putting those measures in place. And something that's really important to note that often slides by when you talk about cloud environments is that you're responsible for all of the data, everything that you create and use within that environment. Often people will assume that if you set it up, whether it's AWS, GCP, or Azure, those companies are responsible for the security of your data, which they are not. Those companies are responsible for the security of the environment that you put that data on, so only for their infrastructure that's there. Whereas you're responsible for absolutely everything that you put within their infrastructure. So any assets you spin up in the same way as if you spun it up physically in front of you, everything to do with that asset and everything that's on that asset is your responsibility to maintain, to protect, to review, to assess, to remediate. All of that falls with you. So if you create assets in a cloud environment and you don't protect them and they have sensitive data on it and anything happens to that sensitive data, you will be 100% held responsible for that breach. Regardless of whose environment you put it on or what you thought they were going to manage, that's your responsibility. And it's a really important thing to know when it comes to things like GDPR, especially when it comes to like data residency as well. Think about where you're putting your assets in those cloud environments. Like all of those top three all have environments in lots of different parts of the world. So bear in mind, if you're spinning up assets that may have PI information on it in Europe, use a European environment to put it up in. Same like if you've got HIPAA requirements, then use the ones on the US side then from there. And there's any multitude of other ones for different countries too. And as a general rule, those three big suppliers will have environments in those locations if there's different regulation required as a rule. Not exclusively, but as a rule. So then, yeah, with the CSPM market was valued at that 2.5 billion in 2024, and it's expected in this next 9 years to be 7.2 billion, which makes sense. Often people will say things like, oh, everybody's on the cloud now, but I think realistically, I'm sure anybody listening to this call knows of a business or an environment that they've had access to that for sure is not in the cloud, even if it's your local library, whatever it is. So there's a lot of movement still to happen, and a lot of fear around, especially when we use a lot of acronyms and a lot of terminology that suddenly excludes a massive volume of the public from understanding what it is that they've got access to. But yeah, it makes sense. I wouldn't be surprised if it was more than what it's projected to be, all depending on how we approach the education of the people that are going to use it at the end of the day. So modern trends and challenges when it comes to the CSPM side of things. So traditionally, compliance was something that we had lots of time to assess and review and document, and then have that reviewed and modified, and then make more changes and then come back to it. Whilst if you're going for a specific compliance standard now voluntarily, like ISO standards and such like that, you would have a bigger window within which to return your results. There are mandated compliance standards that are expected to be in place all the time, regardless of how much time you've had to understand your environment, and things like GDPR, for example. Whether you've run a business or not yourself, if you were to start running a business tomorrow and start using a cloud environment, you would be expected to be compliant from day one from a GDPR perspective. So we're seeing more and more people with that moving from that old I've got time compliance model to having to use to real-time compliance expectations. So that means real-time discovery, real-time threat identification, real-time risk assessment, real-time remediation then as well, all of those from before, which is intimidating when you look at it. And if you think about even the number of vulnerabilities out there that are being found, must be close to about 200,000 of them now, and it's growing all of the time. Definitely year on year, it's like exponential. So it's unlikely that we're going to find a year where we'll have less vulnerabilities found than the year before, certainly with more different kinds of assets being made available and virtual assets then too. So being aware of compliance before any environment is even being spun up would be a wise thing to do, and then understanding where your responsibility. Like I said, if you're looking at things like third-party risk, your AWS, your GCP, and Azure are essentially the third party, and it's their environment they're responsible for aligning to compliance with. You have everything else within your environment, and that could be a multitude of different standards of compliance. I use GDPR because it's the one most people tend to recognize, certainly across Europe, because we're all affected by it as individuals. But there are, I know, even across other parts of Europe, we've got a NIS2 compliance and DORA for banking too, which is a whole other level of compliance that affects both the individuals and the environments that they're on. So having all of your information in real time and knowing what to do with it is really, really important. It's one thing getting it all, and then you have all this information, I don't really know where to start or what to do. And understanding all of that is really important. So there's plenty of courses and things that you can do in order to understand what those four aspects mean: discovery and assessment and risk identification and remediation. I mean, it's easy enough to do courses to understand those, but it's worth having a look into other means to see how to manage all of that when you've got it as a team, as a company, putting it into your CI/CD pipeline, listening to what best practices are for DevSecOps and that side of things then too. And if you can understand as much as possible before you even get started, then you're already ahead of most. I think most people that have moved to cloud environments are learning after the fact and picking it up then. Another little bit of extra flavor, I've mentioned the big three as such when it comes to cloud environments, is none of them use the same terminology as each other. So it takes a while just to get used to what something in one environment means and then what that might mean in a different environment. And just that language alone makes it difficult to manage that multi-cloud environments. And we talk about multi-cloud complexity because the the level of security rules and whatnot that you can put in place can be the same across them all, but it's managed in different ways across them all. And when cloud environments began as such, you might find somebody who was a specialist in a particular environment. You would rarely find somebody who specializes in all three. And even now, it would be unusual to find people that would be able to specialize or talk comfortably about the CSPM side of things for all three of those environments. And then some, I know for me, I used to find that the Azure environment changes the language often, making it just that little bit more difficult then as well, if they're changing what everything is called. And even if it was only once a year that they're changing what things are called, it means that you can lose the run of yourself pretty quickly. So adding those kind of different flavors and different terminologies does, of course, add complexity to it, and then your compliance, and then understanding what you're responsible for and what you're not. It doesn't make it impossible, though. Really, at the core of everything that you're doing, if you begin with permissions and access, you'll have a good, strong start. And then after that, get into the things that are a little bit more complex on bills and such. But there is what's known as, and I don't think I actually have it listed on my slides, which is just-in-time access. And it's something that you can automate too. And many of the environments are used tools to do that as well, which would essentially mean that as you give people access to environments, and you can set up these rules for types of roles, types of departments, or by individuals as well, it would mean that you'd give them access, but you can also give them access for a set amount of time to types of assets, so that they only have limited access to assets for the time that's needed to do whatever job it is that you need them to do on the assets. And that would automatically time out and either revert back to their original permissions or remove their access depending on what you've asked it to do. So let's say you have an auditor that's coming in to check the environment because you're going for a compliance accreditation somewhere. You'll give the auditor access for, I don't know, say it's 3 days that they've got to assess it. You can give them audit level access for 3 days. So it's not a full admin, it's like a review level to all the places they need to have access to so that they can assess you. And then you can have that access automatically disable when they're 3 days at the end of the 3rd day, so you don't have to worry about taking it away. Or maybe you have, in the case of the development side of things, maybe you have devs that are moving around different projects. So excuse me, you might have a developer that you take off one project and put on another project. If you're able to be really fluid with their access there, you can remove the access maybe from the old project, give them access to the new one for a week, 2 weeks, whatever it is that you want them to work on it, and then have it flip back to their old access afterwards. Now that's something that takes a lot of the pain out of the management of the permission side of security when it comes to cloud environments, and not something that's as easily done on traditional networks and environments for sure. But in cloud environments, it's a lot easier to do it, and it's a lot easier to automate then as well. So you can actually build a process where you'll just, populate a few boxes and you're done with dates and times as who has access to what. So whilst it's intimidating to look at from the outside and think about what may need to be done, when you can create those kind of models for roles, your own kind of RBAC settings as such, it's a lot easier to maintain it that way. Then of course, ephemeral resources I spoke about earlier, which is the likes of the Netflix one, where assets are just being spun up and shut down and never seen again. And we talked about managing those as well in that environment with the real-time monitoring or real-time assessment. In that case, like, you obviously have the cost associated with the assets being spun up, and then what you would do is try and find a CSPM product that has the fluidity to allow you to assess ephemeral assets as they're spun up. It's a really important one to think about, so that you don't end up with a product that is billing you for hundreds and hundreds of assets when really you're only spinning up one at a time. But that's how many that happen. It's one worth asking. But many of the cloud environments and many of the products now do allow for that. So if it is something that you do on the regular, just bear that in mind too. It might also be a case that you go, we're not patching it, it's only up for 60 seconds or half an hour. A decision for you to make, not a recommendation on my side. And of course, I talked about the automation, because typically in any cybersecurity team, in any company, there's almost always the number one issue or complaint is raised is the volume of work that needs to be done and the volume of resources that they have available to do it almost never meet in the middle. So anything that can be automated, and especially any of the grunt work, as we might call it, that can be automated. So identifying vulnerabilities and doing the risk assessment, and even on the remediation side, because if they can be automated through whatever process or means that you want, then the team can spend their time figuring out best practices and focusing on things that they're not more important than that, but they're certainly important with regards to the business value side, like compliance from there. And then the last to market as such when it came to cloud products, but some of the most important ones and also too are the likes of healthcare and public cloud. So we'll see, as a general rule, they would in an ideal world move to their own cloud environment and not one that is publicly hosted where Joe blogs anyone can set up a cloud environment. And that tends to be why they've moved that little bit more slowly. And often there's less of a skill set in some of those environments for understanding how to combine both cloud and traditional environments and make them work together as such too. So I have seen in some private companies that are, say, creating patent protected products, have their own hosted cloud environments. I know that certainly in the US, we see, like we talk about FedRAMP qualifications, we see these and private cloud environments that are set up so that they're locked down that a little bit harder and have different regulation in place for them then too. So it's something that there's an appetite in those environments to move towards cloud, but not always the funding or the skill set in order to be able to do it. But I think that's certainly going to be the next level. We need to look, make sure that we're good. And then CSPM in practice, security automation is key, as I've said. I think if we don't spend our time, as if you are a professional, or even if you're not a professional, if you understand what it is and how it works, I think we should all be taking our time to make sure that we help those who don't understand what it is and how it works, whether it's just the basics of security, and then network security, and then cloud security. Then you're going to hear a lot of this, the robots are taking over, because people are afraid of what AI and automation is and don't always understand that using AI and automation can massively decrease the volume of work that somebody on the security side of things has to do. You still should be the one pressing the big red button and making the decisions at the end of the day, but anything that can reduce the volume of work is a win. So the more we can help people that are not the ones that have to press the button understand, but are probably the ones that have to pay the bill, the more we can help them understand that AI and automation are friends when it comes to the security side of things, and they truly help us to get to the real-time view of stuff, then the easier it's going to be able to implement really good cloud security and maintain it there as well. So anyone who's in the trade or about to get into the trade or comfortable talking about it should make it your business and your focus. Sure that everybody understands that it's a good thing to do then as well. Ephemeral resources, you need to think about the tool that you're going to use. So using traditional scanning it will work against your ephemeral resources, but typically you're going to max out on licenses and such straight off the bat. So you want to have a look at something that's going to do real-time scanning, real-time assessment. I know, like, I've obviously worked with different companies, and I know I've worked with companies in the past that have done real-time scanning, where people would have traditionally used, they might have installed an agent on assets by default, and that's how they manage all of their assets. But if you've got ephemeral assets, that's not going to work because those assets won't exist in minutes, hours, days later. So you're going to need to have some sort of continuous real-time scanning in place to identify those assets. That's one part of it. And then when it comes to the remediation side, it's about, you have responsibility to make sure that the assets that you're spinning up meet a good, safe minimum requirement, that you're not spinning up buggy assets to begin with, and you set that requirement and then put rules in place with regards to access to the network for those environments, that maybe you do it that it's limited by the version details that, or maybe it's, you know, can be overwritten by people with X level of permissions, that kind of stuff in place. But ephemerals definitely need to be sat down and thought about, because they often impact the licensing that you have from whatever product you're using to assess them as well. Most products will assess on a per asset basis. So if you're spinning up 1,000 ephemeral assets every week, it's going to get pretty expensive pretty quickly. So in a practical scenario, most CSPM solutions will have a compliance aspect. So it might be a case, let's say, typically with GDPR, you're not assessing, typically with CSPM and GDPR, one is not assessing the other. Some CSPM products, you can look to see if there's things like credit card details or actual people names, and that you can, from that you can see if it affects your GDPR compliance status. But mostly CSPM products are interested in where you have vulnerabilities and access issues. So it's other compliance standards maybe that it's more relevant to. So let's say you want to align to CIS level 2 compliance, which is pretty significantly more stringent than CIS level 1s. And with that, they should be really easy to do with a CSPM product, because usually most CSPM have that built in, and you say, this is what I want to comply to. I want you to assess all of these assets and tell me what I need to change in order to be compliant with CIS level 1 or 2, whichever it is. When it comes to GDPR, you're kind of looking for a product that will retrieve certain kinds of information, which in itself can be information that you're not supposed to have access to under GDPR. So you have to kind of look for generic, you're building out commands as such to look for things like anything that has first name in it, anything that has credit card details, anything that has banking details or PI information. So some products are better than others at identifying if that kind of information is there. And you can use it for that. What you want to do is identify first the standard that you want to comply with. So if you're going for something like an ISO standard, CSPM is only going to be one part of that really pretty big project. But it will be able to give you all the information you need to do a comprehensive job on that one part. So you should be, any good CSPM product will allow you to pull asset information and vulnerability information and patches that are needed and pull them into a report. And normally when you do ISO, what you'll have is like your initial report, and then you'll have, now that I fixed everything and we're in good standing, this is where we're at now with our report. And you might do that every month, quarter, however often you need to do it for the accreditation, and it'll allow you to pull those kind of things. So I would first decide the compliance standard you want to go for, and then sit down and look at what you need to have. It's a pretty big book with the likes of ISO, what you need to have for that, and then what you can pull through your CSPM product. If you've got no compliance in place already, I would suggest starting with CIS level 1 and cherry picking some of your most, probably your public facing assets or your most valuable assets, and starting there for compliance. And then, yeah, seeing, because that will tell you quickly whether you're going to have a lot of work to do or whether you're going to be able to get to that compliance standard fairly readily. And that'll typically dictate what you do next. I love the miserable approach. You have to think about what's going to go wrong. But yes, if you're picking an automation tool, like the first thing you should do before you use any automation tool is identify if there's any known security risks for that and assess your tool. Normally, if there's a tool like that that's going to be so important to you, you should be having some sort of a CSS feed or something that notifies you immediately of a problem. And most companies are pretty responsible and let people know if there's any kind of a problem or a bug. What you also can do is, if you're using a tool like that in your cloud environment, that tool itself will be internal. You shouldn't be hosting it somewhere that's public or external. You'll be hosting it internally and assessing your environments. So you then have additional layers of security that you can put in place. So you should have security in place on your own work that stop people from getting access to that tool, the right levels of permission in place, access only for those who absolutely have to have it, and just-in-time access for those kind of tools would be definitely worth thinking about there too. It could be a case that you have, everybody has, bar one, has read-only access 90% of the time, but once or twice a week or a month, or however often you want to make changes, that you give them edit access for whatever amount of time to make those changes. So again, have a good look at the tools that you're thinking of, and what it is that you want to do. But anyone who's getting any new product at all in that's going to be on your network, whatever that product is, whether it is, you know, a product that you use for your day-to-day or it's a security tool, go and do a bit of research about the security of that tool itself. Typically, they're all pretty good because that's the market they're in, and it would really ruin their business to have issues like that. But you're right, you should be thinking about worst case scenarios all the time. It's a little sad that we have to, but that should definitely be a question that you're asking. And most companies, even companies who don't work in security, will be able to offer you some kind of like an FAQ on the security side of things, or details of their certification and their accreditation to compliance standards on the security side as well, which should give you some comfort then too. There's never going to be a 100% absolutely nobody can hack it setup. Well, there is, it's pen and paper, I guess. But, you know, realistically, there's always going to be the potential somewhere. And if we ever think we're completely covered and we're never going to be hacked, then that's a problem. That in itself is a vulnerability. So you should be looking at the ones that are the most secure, but always preparing for the possibility that anything can be hacked or accessed. You just need one employee who's accidentally left their password out or having a bad day, and gives their details to somebody, and then that's how the access happens. So you're thinking right, but that would be what I would do. All you can do is vet and audit as best you can beforehand to make sure you're as best protected. I don't know if I would advise or recommend. There's always going to be ones out there that, and actually probably across Reddit is where you'll find some of the best recommendations for it. Stuff that, look first for anything that is regulated. If it's open source, just keep an eye on who's using it, because like with open source, obviously that means that everybody can have access to what it can do then as well. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a flaw. I mean, I worked in a company where their product for the first few years was open source, and it built the core product that the company was built on. So it has its benefits. If you're a smaller company or you have budget constraints, yes, it's better than nothing. Let's have a look at it and see what it can do. You're going to want to be a bit more stringent on the security side of it, just with regards it checking what it's capable of doing. Its likelihood of being held to any compliance standards and stuff is less likely, because if it's open source, it's going to move faster. But in most cases, most of the best products in the world is open source, and most of the people that are ahead of the changes certainly in cybersecurity are using or have used open source to at least build a core of something that they're doing. So I certainly would recommend playing around with it. I think if you're going to apply it to a business, think about the liability there. If you have customers that are using your business for something, and you are protecting your business with an open source tool, where does that leave you with regards to any kind of liability or insurance or even reputational protection? And it's not because I think that it's a bad thing. Do not understand that. I don't. I think it's great. But it's about what your customers might think if you're using open source for that, rather than something that's already marketed and regulated in the same way. This is a really good question, and I swear if I could answer it. But what I mean is that the only way you know that your security measures are working really, really well is when you hear nothing about the security in your business. When in your business, if people are talking about breaches and security issues and things that happen within the business, then something is really, really wrong. And sadly, because things are quiet in a business where security measures are really, really good, normally the first thing to do if that business is making any cuts is start cutting the security budget, because we don't need that. Everything is fine. But it's fine until it's not. So the thing to do, I always found the thing to do in that is keep on top of your research for other companies who have already succumbed to breaches. Have a look at how they were breached, what the impact and the cost was to those companies, and always keep it in your back pocket when a conversation comes around about budget and impact, especially if you can relate it to the kind of business that you're in. Because if you can't quantify the potential impact, then you're not in a position to defend a budget and make sure that you get what you need on the cybersecurity side. It's a pain having to do it, but typically, at least in my experience, typically those who are paying the budget for the cybersecurity team are not ones who always understand the importance or the value of the quiet on that side of it in the same way that the cybersecurity team would do. So you have to always keep abreast of the most recent impact. Anything that happens, if there's a breach that comes out and it hits somebody in the same kind of industry, that's a perfect opportunity to remind them that we haven't been breached, and that's because XYZ is in place. And if we had been breached, it would have cost us however many thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions. And that tends to keep people reminded of the value of what it is that you're doing. Yeah, I think for me, it's always going to be the same as remember that there's people that don't understand it. And any way that you can help them to understand it, feel free, steal all of the analogies or all of the different ways of explaining it. The more people that understand the importance of it, the less hassle you're going to have getting budget, and the more people you're going to have backing you. So have a great day.